MMO players have completely lost the plot. Ion 2 has almost every red flag this genre claims to hate. Monetization bloat, pay to win concerns, progression system built around friction, and somehow the community is still treating it as like the next big hope. The thing is, I don't even say that to blame anyone because I kind of get it now. This is just where MMOs are right now. The genre has been so dry for so long that people are so desperate for something new to care about that the conversation isn't even about is this a healthy MMO anymore. It's more like, can I still get enough out of this to justify diving into this game? And that's why Ion 2 is interesting to me. Not because it's uniquely bad, not because it's the first MMO to flirt around pay to win systems or overcomplicated monetization, and not because the people excited for it are somehow wrong. It's interesting because it feels like one of the clearest examples of what MMO genre has become now. A game can show up with all the warning signs people usually complain about and still generate real excitement, real hype, and probably a real healthy player base on launch. Not because players suddenly love bad system, but because when you have gone long enough without a new MMO that actually looks live, your standards have changed. Or maybe standards isn't even the right word, maybe your priorities have changed. You stop asking for a perfect MMO and you start asking for one that at least worth getting invested in. And Iron 2 feels like it's sitting right there in the middle of that. I think the reason Ion 2 became such an easy target for MMO discourse is because the concerns around it were instantly familiar. The moment people started hearing about multiple subscriptions, battle passes, progression systems that looked expensive to keep up with, and all the usual monetization baggage that tends to show up in modern MMOs nowadays, the conversation went exactly where you would expect it to go. People started calling it pay to win, people started worrying about how much the game was going to feel designed around the cash shop itself. People started asking whether this was another one of those MMOs where the game itself looks great, but the system around it slowly chips away at your enjoyment until spending starts to feel less like a choice and more like a shortcut to basic comfort. When a new MMO comes out, most players don't look at combat or world designs or PvP, they look for catches. They look for the friction points. Where does the game slow you down? Where does it become more annoying? Where does progression stops feeling like effort and start feeling like pressure? Where does the game begins nudging you towards opening your wallets? And that's the lens people use now because too many MMOs over the last decades have trained players to think that way. And Ion 2, at least early on, looked like it was heading into the same territory. Not necessarily because it was trying to be some cartoonish evil crash cab MMO, but because it was using systems that immediately create the same anxiety players already associate with bad MMOs monetization. Multiple subs, battle pass layers, gear progression that looks expensive and exhausting, dungeons restrictions, all of that stuff adds up really fast. And once players start feeling like a game is trying to monetize inconvenience, trust disappears almost immediately. And that's why Ion 2 became such a talking point, right? It wasn't just because this looks pay to win, it was more like we have seen this pattern before and we know how these games usually go. And this is the part where I think the conversation gets more interesting because Ion 2 didn't become a big topic just because it had red flags. It became a big topic because despite those red flags, people still care. People are still following it, still arguing about it, still hoping it turns out good, still waiting to see what global looks like. And I don't think that's because MMO players are hypocrites. I think it's because the genre is in a weird place right now. If you're into shooters, RPGs, co-op games, survival games, or whatever, you usually have options, right? Maybe not perfect options, but enough variety that if one game disappoints you, you can move on without feeling like the entire genre has failed you. MMOs don't really work like that. A good MMO isn't a game you finish or move on from, it's something you live in for a while. It's a world you settle into. It's a guild, a routine, a character you keep building over months. It's PvP rivalries, late night grinding, dumb drama in world chat, and that feeling that the game still matters even when you're logged out. And because MMOs demands that kind of investment from players, people don't just want a decent game, they want a place to stay for a while. And that's what makes the genre so hard right now. There aren't many new MMOs coming out that actually feels big enough, polished enough, or alive enough to become that kind of place for anyone. So when one does show up, especially one with strong visuals, large-scale PvP, a recognizable IP, or that classic this could be my next main game energy, people naturally hold on to it. Even if the monetization looks messy, even if the systems looks questionable, even if warning signs are too obvious, because the alternative isn't to go play a better MMO. Sometimes the alternative is just going back to the same games you have already burned out on. And I think that's a big part of why Ion 2 is getting so much attention. Not because everyone thinks it's perfect, but because it looks like a real MMO, a big one, a game with actual ambition behind it, a game that could potentially become somebody's next long-term home, and that matters more than people admit. The thing with AION 2 is that it almost feels like a condensed version of every conversation MMO players have been having for years. Because on one hand, the game has a lot going for it. It looks good, the world has scale, the combat has weight, there's PvP appeal there, there's that sense of a proper MMO world rather than the lightweight online RPG pretending to be one. And that's important because MMO players are not just looking for a progression system, they're looking for atmosphere, they're looking for a world that feels worth committing to, they're looking for that feeling that there's enough game here to justify months of their time. AION 2 clearly understand that side of the genre, and then on the other hand, it also seems to understand modern MMO monetization a little too well. That's where the tension comes from, right? Because the concerns people had weren't random, they came from structure of the game itself. If you hear that a game has multiple subscription and several paid layers before you even really get into the details of it, that already changes the way you see the game. If the gear system looks like one of those systems where every meaningful upgrade also comes with a new round of enhancement cost, stat rerolls, and resources sinks, people are going to assume the game is designed to create frustration. And if dungeon access or progression is limited in ways that make games feel less playable unless you follow a very specific routine, then again it starts feeling like a system built around restriction first and fun second. That's what players are nervous about. Not whether AION 2 looks fun to play on day one, whether it still feels good once the game starts leading to all those systems is the real question. Now to AION 2's credit, this is where the story gets a little more interesting. Because some of the recent changes and announcements around the game are actually meaningful. I think this is the part where a lot of people started softening on it. The biggest one is the monetization cleanup. From the information we have right now, AION 2 is moving away from the old setup of multiple subscription and extra pass style clutter towards a much cleaner model. One subscription, around $16 for 30 days, with a battle pass included in that price. And that matters, right? Not because it suddenly makes the game a saint, not because one submodel automatically means the game is consumer friendly, but because clarity matters in MMO. It doesn't solve every concern, but it does remove one of the biggest early problems, that feeling that the game was trying to monetize you from 5 different angles at once. The other major change is the gear transfer system, and honestly this one might matter even more than the sub change. One of the biggest fears with AION 2 was the idea that gear progression would constantly punish you every time you are upgrading. You get a piece of gear, you invest into it, you enhance it, you reroll stats onto it, you sink a huge amount of time and resources into making it viable, then a better piece drops. And now you're expected to do the whole process all over again. That kind of system is exhausting, and more importantly, it creates exactly the sort of environment where paying to ease the pain starts to feel attractive. But from what we have now, AION 2 is adding unlimited gear transfers, meaning players can carry over that investment from old gear to new gear without the same hard limitations. This is not a small change that directly reduces one of the most punishing parts of the progression loop. It means your investment follows you forward instead of constantly getting reset. It makes gearing feels less like a trap and more like an actual progression. And then there are the dungeon changes too, easing up the entry restriction and removing ticket style barriers to just getting into the content. Again, that might sound like a smaller detail on paper, but in practice, those kind of changes matter a lot because they affect how playable the game feels on day-to-day basis. So yes, AION 2 still deserves scrutiny, but it's also fair to say that the game has made changes that directly addresses some of the biggest reasons people were skeptical in the first place. And this is where we get into the title of the video. Because even if you still think AION 2 represents a lot of what's wrong with modern MMOs, I still think people are going to play it, a lot of people actually. Not because the concerns were fake, not because everyone suddenly stopped caring about monetization, and not because one cleaner subscription model fixes every problem. People are going to play it because it still offers something the MMO audience wants badly enough to tolerate the uncertainty of it. A big world, a fresh start, a new economy, new PvP, new progression system, a new game to learn, optimize, complain about and sink time into with friends, and that matters. AION 2 doesn't have to be perfect to succeed. It doesn't even have to be universally trusted. It just needs to be compelling enough, and that's the bar now for the new MMOs. If new MMO looks polished enough, ambitious enough and alive enough, people will at least try to make it work. They will tell themselves the monetization might not be that bad in practice, They will wait for global details. They will watch how the first few weeks go. They will see what whales can do. They will wait for classes guides and PvP impressions and dungeons breakdowns. In other words, they will do exactly what MMO players do when a new games pop out. They will keep the door open for them. I don't think that's irrational. I think it's just a reflection of how little the genre has to offer to its players lately. When the MMO space is healthy, players can afford to be picky. They can walk away from a game the moment it starts looking manipulative because there are other worlds to go live in. When the MMO space is dry, though, people become much more willing to compromise, not because they don't see the problem, but because they don't want to miss the next game that might actually feel worth caring about. That's what Ion 2 is benefiting from. Ion 2 isn't really the villain, it's the mirror. That's why I don't really look at Ion 2 as the sole problem here. If anything, it feels more like a mirror. It reflects the exact place the MMO genre is in right now. On one note, you have developers building in a market where monetization has become deeply embedded into MMO systems, not always because they are trying to ruin the game, but because the business model of live service MMOs has become tied to layered systems, recurring revenues, and friction points that can be softened through spending. On the other side, you will have players who will still be chasing the feelings of MMOs used to give, that feeling of discovering a new world, building characters over time, finding a community you set in, and getting lost in that game for months. Those two things collide in games like Ion 2, and that's where the conversation around it feels so conflicted. People can see the warning signs, they can also see the appeal. They can criticize about monetization and still be interested in it. They can talk about pay to win concerns and still hope the game lands well. They can be cautious and curious at the same time. And honestly, I think that's the most realistic way to look at it. Ion 2 doesn't need to be framed as either the savior of MMOs or the death of the genre. It's probably neither. It's just a modern MMO arriving at a time where the community is hungry enough that even a flawed one can feel important. And maybe that's the uncomfortable part. Not that Ion 2 has problems, but that those problems no longer automatically push people away. Instead, they have become a part of that calculation. So when I say Ion 2 is everything what's wrong with MMOs, but will still play it, I don't mean that as some cheap dunk on the game or people getting excited for it. I mean it as a snapshot of where the genre is. Ion 2 has a lot of warning signs people are tired of. Messy monetization history, pay to win concerns, progression system that can easily feel pressed instead of having fun, and that constant MMO fear that the game is going to ask you for just a little too much from your wallet rather than your time. But it also has that exact things MMO players keeps looking for, right? Scale, ambition, PvP, proper world, and the possibility that this could be the next game people disappear into for months. And that's the trade-off the genre has to offer to us. Not because players are blind, not because developers are uniquely malicious, but because the MMO space has become a place where people are constantly weighing frustration against possibilities. And Ion 2 turning out to be one of the clearest examples of that in a long time. It's a game people should absolutely be cautious about, but it's also a game people are still going to try. Because for MMO players in 2026, this is the kind of reality we live in. You don't wait for a perfect MMO anymore, you wait for one that looks alive enough to be worth the risk. And that's it for today, guys. It's your boy Kabuza. I'll see you on the next one. Tada, bye bye, sayonara.